Well, welcome back, everybody, as we broadcast you live from UNISA. This, of course, is the start of the National Convention, which is the lead-up to the National Dialogue. This has been something that's been in the pipeline for quite some time, but now we have finally seen the day has arrived, and this convention is set to take place. I suppose it's still a bit difficult for the average South African, and including myself, because as the morning's been unfolding, I've sort of been snippets of information as to how it's actually going to work. But that's what we're going to try and get to now, is how this whole process is going to unfold. Because there's been a lot of reservations from South Africans in the run-up to it. Not only South Africans, some political parties, some foundations pulling out of it. But I imagine that the door is still open for anybody that wants to return and be a part of this, to try and talk about South Africans' most pressing problems. But who are the South Africans that are being represented? Well, anyway, let's talk about this. So my first guest that I'm going to be talking to is somebody I'm sure you're quite familiar with, Nomboniso Gasa. She's a researcher and rural activist. She's also part of the Eminent Persons Group and has been quite active in the discussions leading up to this. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, Nomboniso, and thank you so much for talking to us.
Good morning. Good morning to listeners.
So let's talk about, perhaps I think it's a good starting point to talk about the lead up to it, because it hasn't been the smoothest start, and there have been some very, difficult things that have needed to come through. But you've been a part of this. How has the process been so far?
Well, I think that a process as important as this, a process that hopes to chart the way forward for our country, is understandably intense. It is understandably exciting to be able to have a platform of this nature, but in that process there are contestations. And so it's not as smooth as we would want. And also it is in the nature of a process, like if we remember what happened in the early 90s, if we take ourselves back to that where negotiations collapsed at some point or appeared that they were about to collapse, right until the moment when we were about to go to the ballot box, the IFP was not part of that process. Right-wing Afrikaners were protesting the process, and on the eve of elections, somehow it all came together and IFP was on the ballot paper. I think that this is not just a South African example. Many countries that have national dialogues, there is this level of contestation. And our role in the Eminent Persons Group is to ensure that people that are supposed to be here, that they are here. Organizations, communities that may be left out of this process, that we ensure that they come back. Our commitment as the EPG is to ensure that political parties, because they represent key constituencies in this country, people vote for them, that they actually become part of this process. We also are in the process of talking to the national foundation, the legacy foundations, and ensure that they can come back to the process, and that the design of the steering committee after the National Convention leaves room for people who are not part of this process for them to participate.
And that is important, because, and I think it's an important point to touch on, is that a process like this is not a smooth process, because we're in a very difficult position as a country. There are many differing views, there are many differing ideals, and people want their voices to be heard. However, it's coming from a trust deficit of South Africans, and I'm sure you can understand that. I mean, you deal with rural communities, you speak to people that feel they are forgotten and that nothing is working for them, and that, yes, we're here in the room of UNISA, this is the main session where the president is going to open it, but they're not seated here and their voices are not here. What do you say to people like that?
I think firstly the trust deficit. We have to acknowledge the fact that we're at this point as a country, partly because people have been disappointed, gravely disappointed in how government has handled governing this country. Secondly, a lot of processes that have consulted South Africans, a lot of processes that were aimed to recover the South African democracy, like the Zondo Commission and many others, people feel that whatever the positive outcomes of those processes, they are limited in the face of what they see as a lack of follow through. So we've got to own that. Yeah. We've got to say that a lot has been done by the government that has resulted in the trust deficit that we see. Having said that, we also need to be very careful that we don't listen only to our echo chambers, and especially echo chambers of people whose voices are often heard. I was home in rural Eastern Cape this last weekend. And I was surprised, A, by the fact that people knew that I was in the eminent persons group. Secondly, the fact that they wanted to start the dialogue there and then. And one of the issues that came up was around the 350 SRD grants. And they said very clearly to me that when government plans, they plan for rural areas, rural communities, as if they are planning for people who live in Soweto. They made an example. They say the 350 grant is 350 for everybody across the country. Whereas in my village, for them to access the 350, they have to take a taxi to town, pay 50 rands, and come back again with another. So they pay 100 rands to retrieve the 50 rands. So what they get is 250 rands. You know, this is something that I wouldn't have thought about in terms of that detail. So when you say they are not here, indeed, they are not here. And we need to make sure that the dialogue, when it unfolds, that those voices are prioritized. There's no point in a dialogue where you listen to people like myself. Yeah. The key issue is, how do we listen to South Africans? How do we learn for South Africans? Because many of us think that we know the problems of this country. We know some. You know, and the people that I advocate that should be listened to, should be heard, should be present, they don't only come into the spaces with problems. They also come with solutions. So there has to be a humility from the leadership of the country, from the NGOs, from everybody who has had access to be able to speak at the moment. There has to be a humility that says the people in whose name we say we speak, actually, they have their own mouths, they have their own brains, and we need to listen to them.
100%. Good luck. Good luck. Thank you for talking to us. So giving us a good perspective of the run-up to this, what is hoping to sort of be achieved, and some of the issues that have been wrangling behind the scenes. Nomboniso Gasa, thank you so much. So how is it going to work? Because I am still a little bit confused as to how that rural voice is going to land up here, even though they are not in the room. So this is where I move on to the whole planning behind this, and how the actual national convention is going to come up with the framework of how it's going to work, and how do we reach those people, those voices in the wards, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to the issues that South Africans face. And this is where I've got Reverend Zwo Nevhutalu, who is the National Convention spokesperson, to talk to us and hopefully get a better understanding of how this is going to work. Reverend, thank you. Thank you for talking to us.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Explain to me how it's going to work. So as we heard from Nomboniso, rural voices are not necessarily in the room, but we want to know their problems. How is this process going to unfold?
Yes, rural voices will be represented in the convention, in the room, but not too many people can make it to the convention. So what is going to happen is that we should bear in mind that the most important part of this are the dialogues themselves. Here, we're kicking off the process. We are agreeing on the how. In other words, the methodology. We are agreeing on indicative themes, because we cannot be prescriptive to South Africans. We must give South Africans the freedom to be able to come up with the themes and issues which are very important to them. And then after this convention itself, when the steering committee would have been constituted, we are going to then have a rollout. We are expecting that with effect from the 1st of September, the rollout is going to happen. Then we go to villages. Now, I need to explain that there will be facilitators. Facilitators well-trained on the methodology and able to ensure that everyone's voice is not drowned during the course of the dialogue process. And then the dialogues or the outcomes of each dialogue will be captured. They will be collated. There will be further discussions. Now, when we go out to the dialogue process, they will be ward-based. 3 per wards are planned. That's what is being put into this convention. There will also be what we call citizens-led. Citizens-led, it means that if you would like to initiate, citizens-initiated, if you want to initiate a dialogue in your church, in your community, you can register and actually start such a dialogue, and you can even ask for a facilitator and ensure that the outcome of that dialogues actually make their way into the final document, which is going to be discussed by the final and last convention to come up with a social compact of this country under the theme Uniting Voices, Shaping Our Country.
Yeah. It sounds so smooth. Sounds like it's going to be an easy process. This is not an easy process. And I will touch on how this is all going to work in the implementation phase in our next interview. But, I mean, how is it that, I mean, we're a country of over 60 million people, and there are many problems that we all are fully aware of. And so we know the problems are out there. Why is it that we need to speak about them? And I think that's what South Africans are asking. Why is it that we need to speak about what we should and do already know?
Because South Africans are very important. Citizens are very important. And if you look at what we know at the moment, you might say that we know a little bit, a lot of them are like anecdotal in nature. We have never, as a country, actually engaged in this kind of dialogues where we look at South Africa as citizens. Very often we look at various problems from our own interests and from sectoral interests, for instance. We are going to engage in a process where we are going to look at issues of South Africa as citizens so that we can come up with common solutions that takes this country shapes this country going forward and have a common vision. We don't have it. South Africans are extremely fragmented. Even looking at those problems that you are saying now, stating to me that we know them, there are very different perspectives about it. That is why the theme is uniting voices, shaping our country, because there are too many perspectives. Can we sit back and say, now, in terms of the methodology, I am going to subject my views, listen to the other people, and make sure that I really look at what not only in my own interest, but in the interest of South Africa at large.
We've got to leave it there. I look forward to it. This is just a start of what is going to unfold, and we're going to see how this process is going to work. Reverend, thank you. Reverend Zwo Nevhutalu is the National Convention spokesperson talking to us about, and I think one comment that really stood out for me is that, you know, do we all, South Africans, do we have a common problem, or do we interpret other people's problems? I'm wondering, education, crime, is this everyone's problem or just some people's problems? I don't know. I think we know our problems as South Africans, but how do we address them? And yes, we can talk about them. And yes, a framework can be drawn up. But is it going to be implemented? And that is the question, and that is the problem that I think South Africans are grappling with when it comes to this national dialogue. All right, we'll have a little bit more analysis in the next hour when you come to us here at UNISA. This, of course, is where this is all going to kick off. We'll see the President at about 11 o'clock opening this, and the seats being filled with those that have been invited and represented here.